A little bit about NAPA. You can see we have a number of different programs. Most of you are familiar with the National Asphalt Pavement Association. We do a lot of work with science-based programs, classifications. Our members are the producers of asphalt pavement. We have things like an environmental product declaration, probably doesn't affect what you all do, but we do provide other types of I hope this doesn't keep going on the speed thing. We do provide other types of guidance for regulatory compliance to help our members. So with regards to today, we're talking about the silica rule, and there's three kind of things I want to focus on. Dave did a great job on the obligations and implementation dates. The construction part of that rule is in effect right now. We do have a number of different guidance documents on our website. I encourage you to take a look at those, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a second. And then I want to talk a little bit about the milling activities, the brooming activities, which your ARRA probably your members probably don't participate in as much as some of your other activities, but that is for road construction contractors. That is a big issue, and that needs to be addressed, and I was talking to David a little bit earlier today. As David indicated, silica exposure is definitely a known health hazard, and it's a priority for the agency. The rule was decades in the making. Again, it was finalized recently, and what it basically does is it cuts that exposure level of respirable crystalline silica from 250 microgram per cubic meter, we'll just call those units, from 250 units down to 50 units. So it's a pretty substantial cut, going from 250 to 50 in the construction industry. The proposed rule, and as David indicated, there's a whole bunch of processes with the rulemaking. The proposed rule initially would require, for example, respirators during milling operations and a statement that had no visible dust. That's been changed due to some of the data that we provided the agency. As David mentioned, we participated in this government, labor, industry kind of partnership where we kind of addressed identified the best types of controls to use in milling machines. Here's just a shot during one of these kind of mill fests, we call them, where we had all these different manufacturers of these mills out on some roadways, tearing up some roads, or actually tearing up some airport pavements. And we kind of looked at what those controls would do. It was a 10-year partnership. And basically, from our perspective, it resulted in the fact that the agency was comfortable enough with those controls that individuals associated with milling operations would not have to wear respiratory protection, which in my opinion is a huge deal. Again, the big picture on the final rule, it sets this PEL, their standard, to 50 units from 250. Construction compliance is now general industry. For those that operate in general industry, asphalt plant would be in a general industry. That compliance will be in June of next year. Many of you probably have heard about a variety of different efforts to halt the rule. I do not think that's going to happen at this point. Really never panned out. The basic premise of the rule, again, is these specific engineering controls that are identified for a whole bunch of different kinds of activities or jobs or tasks, and they're found under Table 1. There are 3 or 4 other major obligations of the rule, regardless of whether or not you follow Table 1. And those would include designating a competent person. That's very important. Everyone's going to have to do that. Develop a written exposure control plan, and I have an example of one of those. Everyone's going to have to do that. And communicate hazards appropriately as part of a hazard communication program. So that, in my mind, that's kind of the big picture of what the rule is. You saw this earlier. The red is basically just these specified exposure control methods, like we said, Table 1, or you can monitor your employees. I'm not going to go into those. Here's, again, a different way of looking at the entries on Table 1. The stuff that's bolded out would have more applicability to road construction activities. Here's a good example of following Table 1 versus not following Table 1. So, in general, these Table 1 controls would involve activities that would require a water suppression system, for example, possibly a vacuum system in some examples, and also possibly in an enclosed cab in some situations. If the table requires an enclosed cab for a piece of equipment, there are a couple of other subparts to that requirement that have to be followed. Like, for example, you have to have a special HEPA-like filter on it. You have to ensure that your seals are working properly. It has to be pressurized. You have to have air conditioning and heating. Is that correct, David? I think that's part of the standard, right? And also, there's a housekeeping part of that, too. So if you go into an enclosed cab and it's required under the Table 1, there are some additional things that you need to kind of pay attention to. So on the picture up on top is a good picture of a wet saw cutting mechanism, and on the bottom is the dry saw cutting mechanism. If that employer chooses not to implement those engineering controls, and it's their, they can do that, then they would have to measure the exposure of those particular activities, make sure that that exposure is below a certain level. In my opinion, it would have to be below the action level because, as David indicated, once it goes above that 25 units, then a whole other bunch of stuff kind of kicks in. You need to restrict access to certain employees. It's dedicated clothing issues. And then you get into all this medical monitoring and PPE and stuff we really don't want to get into if we don't have to. And that's why the way OSHA put this rulemaking together, in my opinion, is pretty cool. It's like a stick and a carrot. If you do these kind of things that they've identified on Table 1, there's really much less obligation, but there's still a couple of things that you have to do. Milling operations and controls. David had a table that showed it. I've kind of done it in a little different format. I think it's pretty straightforward. There's no allowable controls for milling greater than 4 inches of concrete at this point. All the milling machines now, today, it was a voluntary commitment as of January of this year, and I know a lot of milling manufacturers were putting both of these pieces of control equipment on their machines. That would be a vacuum system and an enhanced water suppression system internal to the machine. If you have both of those controls, you can cut any depth of asphalt. If you want to retrofit your pieces of equipment and you don't want to necessarily retrofit it with a vacuum system, which would be a little bit more expensive, and I think generally the full kit of retrofit might cost somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000, but I know that if you just do the water spray, enhanced water spray, it's much, much less. So if you want to choose to do that, then you would be only allowed to mill up to 4 inches in any pavement. And I do know some companies, for example, that are actually specifying that they don't want to necessarily cut greater than 4 inches, and they'll, so that they have a water suppression system, and anything greater than 4 inches, they might contract that out so that someone else would have to put that additional control equipment on those mills. Small mills, as David indicated previously, like the skid steer mill, for example, would require a water suppression system and a surfactant or a detergent. I think of an enclosed cab kind of as a best practice. It's not necessarily required, but I know a lot of those skid steer mills have enclosed cabs. I would say that's a best practice. Here's something, just a comparison on brooming and sweeping. I'm going to limit my comments on this one at this point because it is a little bit controversial and it's not probably as applicable to this industry, ARRA members, as it would be on the road construction side, unless I'm mistaken. I mean, just curious, by a show of hands, does anybody in this room have assets that operate power brooms? Well, you do. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about this. So under that table 1, there's 2 entries at the very end. I think it's 17 and 18. Is that correct, David? And basically what they say is kind of, if you have these heavy pieces of equipment and utility vehicles, all right, that either abrade or fracture silica-containing materials, or they don't abrade or fracture that material, okay, then there's 2 kinds of things that would need to be done. If you're abrading it, then the standard would say you need to have an enclosed cab and a water suppression system if grounds crew are present, but you would need to have an enclosed cab on that piece of equipment. If you're not abrading silica-containing materials, then the standard would say you would either have to have a water suppression system, or they would say you could have an enclosed cab if the operator is the only one engaged in the activity. So in general, it's my understanding, because I'm not in the agency, that a water suppression system kind of covers everybody to a certain extent. People on the ground, including the operator of the equipment. If you don't have people on the ground for these activities, and you fall under that table, then you would need to have an enclosed cab. I'll talk a little bit more about this. This text here comes from what David had identified as the small entity compliance guide, for lack of a better term, for the construction industry. I highly suggest you take a look at that. It provides a number of different examples. So in this case, it talks about this Table 1 entry about heavy equipment that's braids or fractures, and I've kind of highlighted the pertinent issues. If you're braiding or fracturing material, like a mill would kind of do, all right, then the operator would need to be in an enclosed cab, and when other employees are engaged, then you'd have to have dust suppression kind of system. And it gives some examples of what those activities are. Fracturing or abrading rock and soil, demolishing concrete, loading, dumping, and removing demolition debris. Again, this is also the companion part to that. This would be part 18, I think it is. So this would be heavy equipment utility vehicles for grading and excavating, for an example. They include earth moving, grading, excavating, other activities, moving, loading, dumping, things like that. Employers have two control methods. As I kind of mentioned, the first one would be to put the operator in an enclosed cab if there are no other people on the ground, or they would have to have a water suppression system, and you could have that enclosed cab as well, but you would need that if there are other individuals associated with that activity on the ground. David also mentioned exposure assessment kind of thing. So I say OSHA requires exposure assessment when you're using non-controlled equipment or when it's not in Table 1. An employer needs to kind of understand this thing called an 8-hour time-weighted average. It's kind of taken over an 8-hour typical workday. Silica does have a low Pell, but it still would allow for elevated short-term types of exposure. You know, for example, if you're just going to have saw cutting activities, and let's just say they're dry saw cutting, even though OSHA prohibits it, I know that some state agencies require dry saw cuts. And so if that's the case, and you might be doing this activity, you know, 2 or 3 times during an 8-hour time period, whatever, a workday, if you know what those exposures are, you can calculate out what that 8-hour time-weighted average is. You may or may not be below the Pell, but that's a situation where you would need to monitor for that. OSHA allows alternate methods of exposure assessment as well. David mentioned this. I particularly like to utilize something called a real-time dust monitor with the understanding of what the silica content is in the material and the airborne dust. And there's some pretty good publications out there which identify that. These monitors are pretty inexpensive. You can rent them daily for about $150 a day. It comes pre-calibrated. You can walk around to different activities, kind of understand what the respirable dust levels are, and then if you have some additional information, you can kind of identify where a higher crystalline silica, where activities may have increased respirable crystalline silica content, and if that's the case, you might want to do some more formal monitoring. But this is a good first cut at kind of what your activities are and what you need to focus on a little bit more. I would say in some of the work I've seen in the milling industry, a good rule of thumb might be that the typical aggregate might pick up about 10% crystalline silica in a respirable dust type of sample. David had kind of indicated if you assume 100%, then you're probably safe. But there's some data that shows about 10, 20%. So I've given you kind of an example where you might have an uncontrolled brooming operation like below. And it would be relevant if this was not considered under Table 1, if it's a short duration or non-specific activities. Like I give an example, dry saw cutting, flaggers in a dusty environment, truck drivers. Again, the important thing is to have those individuals remain below that action level of 25 units. You can use these kind of real-time monitors to get an idea about what that is. All this kind of should be part of this exposure control plan and reviewed by your employer's designated competent person on the job or the company. And I'm going to talk a little bit about more of that in a second. It would require for these types of activities some type of an exposure assessment. And I put the word "but" in there because I am not a big proponent of going and monitoring individuals, because once you start to stick monitors on individuals or do some sampling, there are a whole bunch of these record-keeping requirements as part of other OSHA standards where you're going to have to maintain this information for 30 years. I think it's actually 30 years past the date of employment for an individual. So there's pretty substantial record-keeping requirements once you start to monitor individuals. And that's why the beauty of the Table 1, if you have equipment with these types of controls on it, you don't have to do all that other stuff. Designating a competent person. A competent person in the standard is defined as someone who can identify existing and foreseeable silica hazards, and this is important, is authorized to promptly eliminate or minimize those particular hazards and has the knowledge and ability to implement the written exposure control plan. You need to take this seriously. If you are a company out there that is doing road construction work, you have to make sure you have designated an individual as a competent person. NAPA has some training materials that are free that you can go to our website, or you can give me a call or send me an email. I will point you in the direction of how this thing goes together, all right? But you need to do that. The competent person duties would include 4 bullets down, frequent and regular job site or equipment inspections, and again, the implementation of that exposure control plan. They don't have to remain on the job site, but they do need to have the authority to take corrective action, which potentially could include halting work. I personally recommend a crew chief, a 4-person, or another supervisor type of individual who regularly kind of works on these job sites or has the potential to inspect pieces of our equipment or the job itself. Written exposure control plan. Again, the employer, and this is an employer responsibility, has to develop these things called a written exposure control plan that then can be implemented by the competent person. It can be generic, it doesn't have to be project specific, but it could cover all kind of roadway milling activities with a large mill, saw cutting activities with this kind of configuration or whatever. Those have to be in this written exposure control plan. I have a couple of examples in a second. The plan has to have the following information. You can read that, and I will read it to you also, but basically it has to have a description of the task. It has to identify some of the engineering controls that are used or work practices. Housekeeping has to be identified, how you're going to limit exposure, and some of the procedures to restrict other access when necessary to limit exposure. All that needs to be in the exposure control plan. And David, please correct me if I'm mistaken on anything that has to do with compliance obligations, because that's the last thing that I want to tell anybody is incorrect information. So I'm close. Okay. All right. I'd suggest, if you haven't gone, take a look at this website, silica-safe.org. All right, that you can create a exposure control plan right off of this website for a variety of different activities. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to just walk real quickly through this, but I would say spend some time looking at it. It might be helpful. But it's like this basically check off boxes, and then it kind of self-develops this kind of plan for you. And it gets emailed. You got to put in some information. I think you have to register, but it doesn't really go anywhere. But there's all these boxes you got to fill out. Pretty straightforward. I think it works pretty well. Also, I did pull up an example of a written exposure control plan by, I believe it was Michigan's OSHA, and they have kind of something that's out there for people to utilize. I have taken the liberty of filling this one in particular, out. These are blank when you get them, but I've kind of taken the liberty of filling them out so that you can kind of see how something like this might work. So you get the company, name, you have the competent person or the person completing the plan, and you've identified the competent person, and now you're talking about a location or a job site. So in this case, it says all road construction projects where existing asphalt pavement surfaces will be milled using a half-lane or larger coplanar mill. Table 1, all right? Description of the task. Pretty short, filled out, check some things off there. I can give you access to this kind of written plan at this point. Talks about engineering controls, what they are, how they're implemented, work practices, has a little bit of description about work practices, housekeeping, restricting access, it's all there. All that information that's required to be on an exposure control plan is there on 1-2 pieces of paper. You need to have that, though. You have to have it either in that kind of thing or other forms. You got to have a written exposure control plan. We talked a little bit earlier about the inspectors or enforcement of the silica standard. Road construction work is pretty visible, especially if it's during the day. And with the silica standard, in my opinion, if an inspector sees a dusty situation, because all of these exposure controls are minimizing the dust, not so that there's no dust, but greatly minimizing it. If an inspector sees this huge cloud of dust coming up from somewhere, in my opinion, there may be questions as to, hey, what's going on? We really shouldn't be seeing that amount of dust. And hey, do you know that there's have you implemented controls for the silica rule? Who's the competent person on the job? Someone better know who that is. Do you have a written exposure control plan for these activities? So I would say, be prepared. I don't think there's going to be targeted enforcement really. There's gazillions of different kinds of construction jobs going on, saw cutting, demolition, all kinds of stuff that inspectors can be viewing. But in my mind, if an inspector or an individual or an employer sees a dusty situation under this new rule, it kind of raises the specter of, hey, what's going on? Are there appropriate controls? Hazard communication and record keeping, the last two kind of things. Got to comply with OSHA's HAZCOM rule. You need to train the workers and stuff on recognizing silica hazards and on workplace protections and things like that. They have to know who the competent person is, and medical surveillance program if applicable, and hopefully it's not applicable. Record keeping standards are identified by that citation there. You have to maintain these records for the appropriate duration, like I said, 30 years after employment. That includes air monitoring data, objective data, medical records, it's my understanding, and even theoretically, MSDSs or safety data sheets, because it's my understanding that some of that may constitute a medical exposure record. Is that right, David, on that, on the SDSs?
Yeah, the SDSs are exposure records if there is no other exposure data.
Okay. So 30 years. Put them in a box, mark them. So here's my last slide. Compliance for construction activities is now. I don't think it's going to be halted. Everybody was kind of holding their breath. I don't think it's going to be halted. Requires employers to identify these job task exposures. Milling partnership was very successful. They are going to require controls. They're already built into the mills. Brooms, probably going to need water suppression in an enclosed cab. We do have a lot of data coming in from brooms that shows that water suppression is extremely effective, especially with a surfactant. And especially after it follows a mill that has these new pieces of control equipment on it as well. I don't know if people have kind of seen this, but milled material now with the new pieces of control equipment are wetter, clumpier. And if you follow that with a broom that has that water suppression system on it, is really no dust at all. I mean, and the data is kind of backing that up at this point. Brooms will likely need that water suppression in closed cab. Again, it's dependent on how the employer or OSHA is going to classify all this thing, these types of utility vehicles or heavy pieces of equipment. I talked to David a little bit earlier. We're working with some contractors right now to get some objective data across the country. And this is the last slide, bottom line. It's the employer's responsibility to make sure your operations are compliant with the rule. You need to identify your company's competent person. You need to develop written exposure control plans for your activities. Utilize exposure assessment information to help you, whether it be a handheld real-time meter to kind of understand where those high exposures might be. Make sure your HAZCOM plan is updated, and make sure you keep the appropriate records. And myself or our organizations are more than willing to help. And so with that, I think we have a little bit of time. If anybody has some kind of outstanding questions, let's kind of hear what they are at this point, if you feel comfortable. Yeah?
I got two. One, is the competent person required on a job or just required designated in the company?
Okay. I'm going to give you my opinion on it, and David will correct me if I'm wrong, but according to the standard, a competent person is not required on the job. It can be one designated individual, like a safety leader or something in an organization, but that individual would have to have the ability to, or has the ability to inspect the job site, frequently, whatever that means, inspect the job site, and has the ability to halt work if necessary or change, activities or whatever. So it's not per job, it's not on the job. It can be an individual at a company level.
The language in the standard is frequent and regular inspections, so the competent person needs to make those frequent and regular inspections. The standard doesn't specify that they need to be on site at all times or specify the frequency of those inspections, but they need to make regular inspections such that they're ensuring that the controls are working effectively.
The
I would say, in my opinion, because again, OSHA doesn't really give you a whole lot of detail on what this is, but in my opinion, it would be for a like activity. So, for example, you could have, if you're milling a bunch of different roads in different locations, and you're following under Table 1, the exposure control plan is pretty much going to be the same.